I remember that day so clearly. It was just like any other. I sat in the living room, eyes glued to the screen, the soft hum of the TV in the background. I was used to these quiet afternoons, where nothing ever seemed to happen. It was routine, and routine was safe. Mom was out running errands, and I knew she'd be back soon, so the world outside our home felt like it was still in its right place. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing to worry about. Dad was there too, sitting in his usual spot on the couch. He wasn't saying much, which was strange. He was usually chatty, especially on days like this when we were both home and it was just the two of us. But today he seemed distant, like his thoughts were somewhere else. I glanced at him a few times, but he wasn't looking at me. His eyes were fixed on the TV screen, his face blank, with that look I couldn't quite read. I remember thinking that he seemed off, like there was something heavy on his mind. But I didn't press. After all, Mom would be home soon, and whatever was on his mind, it would pass. If these stories resonate with you, subscribe to Confession Cabin and join our community. Share your experiences in the comments. Your voice could bring comfort to someone who needs it. It wasn't until the show started that I began to feel like something was wrong. Dad had turned on a documentary, something about betrayal and affairs. It was strange because he wasn't usually into that kind of thing. He had always preferred action movies or sports, something light to fill the quiet. This, though, was different. The narrator's voice filled the room, discussing the complicated web of lies that often followed infidelity. The stories of cheating and deceit seemed far away from me, like they were something that happened to other people in other lives. But as the camera showed interviews with broken families, I couldn't help but feel an uncomfortable shift in the air. I kept glancing at Dad, trying to figure out why he was so interested in this documentary. His face remained unreadable, and that only made the unease inside me grow. Was he trying to tell me something? I shook the thought away. Maybe he was just bored, or maybe he'd watched everything else on TV. Mom would be back soon. I kept telling myself that, as if it was some kind of reassurance. It was all fine. Nothing was wrong. But the more I tried to convince myself of that, the more it felt like something was lurking just beneath the surface, just waiting to be discovered. I didn't know it then, but that afternoon would be the beginning of everything changing. Everything I knew would shatter, and nothing would ever feel the same again. As the show went on, something in Dad's eyes shifted. It wasn't just the screen he was staring at, it was something deeper. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt it. The tension in the air seemed to grow thicker with every passing minute. The room felt colder somehow, even though it was a warm afternoon. I could feel a knot forming in my stomach as I continued watching, unsure if it was the show itself or the strange way Dad was acting that had me on edge. The documentary dove deeper into the stories of betrayal, of marriages unraveling, families torn apart by secrets. The narrator spoke of how trust was so easily broken, how lies piled up until the weight of them was unbearable. It was unsettling to listen to, and I couldn't help but look over at Dad. His expression was intense, like he was soaking in every word, every image on the screen. I wanted to ask him if he was okay, if something was wrong, but I hesitated. He seemed lost in his own thoughts, far away from the room we were sitting in. The more I watched him, the more it felt like he wasn't just watching a documentary. He was searching for something. Was it answers? Was he trying to make sense of something? I couldn't understand it. I kept telling myself it didn't matter, that it was just a show and nothing more. But every time I caught his gaze, it sent a chill down my spine. He wasn't looking at me, and he wasn't looking at the TV anymore either. His mind seemed to be somewhere else, somewhere I couldn't reach. I started to feel like I was intruding on something private, like I was witnessing something I wasn't supposed to see. Dad was always so open with me, but today felt different. He didn't want to talk, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to ask. I was just waiting for the moment when things would snap back to normal, when Mom would walk through the door, and this strange, uncomfortable tension would vanish. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. The more I watched, the more I felt like this wasn't just some random documentary we were watching. It was a glimpse into something bigger, something that had already begun to unfold between Dad and me, even if I didn't fully understand it yet. I wanted to believe everything was fine, but a part of me knew it wasn't. That nagging feeling wouldn't go away, and I couldn't shake the thought that Dad was hiding something from me. Something important. It wasn't long before my suspicions started to bubble up. The subtle signs were too clear to ignore. The way Dad checked his phone constantly, his attention darting away whenever I looked over, was starting to feel like a red flag. It wasn't just the frequent glances at the screen, it was the way he seemed almost nervous when he thought I wasn't paying attention. I tried to brush it off at first, convincing myself it was nothing, but as the days went by, it became harder to ignore. He had always been someone who was comfortable in his own skin, someone who never seemed to hide anything, especially from me. But now, there was a distance, a coldness, something I couldn't quite place. He would leave the room suddenly, excuse himself more often than usual, and I'd catch him muttering under his breath, as if in conversation with someone else, but not in a way that made sense. I didn't want to confront him, not yet. It didn't feel right to ask questions when there wasn't enough evidence to back up the strange feelings I had. But the little things kept adding up, one after another, and with every passing day, my gut told me something was wrong. The turning point came one evening when I was in the kitchen, finishing some homework. I heard the unmistakable sound of Dad's voice coming from the living room. At first, I thought nothing of it. He was probably talking to a friend or colleague. But then his voice dropped lower, and I heard the words, "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt like I had been caught in a lie, even though I hadn't done anything wrong. I couldn't help myself. I tiptoed closer to the living room, trying to make myself small, to remain invisible. I didn't want him to know I was eavesdropping, but I couldn't shake the overwhelming need to know what was going on. The conversation continued, but I couldn't catch the words clearly. All I could make out was the tone, a mix of guilt and tension. Dad was talking to someone on the phone, and it wasn't Mom. His voice was hushed, like he didn't want me to overhear. I stood there, frozen, trying to piece together what I had just heard. My thoughts raced, and in that moment it felt like the ground was slipping from under me. The conversation ended quickly, and when I looked at Dad again, his face was pale, his expression strained. He didn't meet my eyes. I wanted to ask him what was going on, to demand an explanation, but I didn't. I couldn't. Not yet. Part of me was afraid of what the truth might be, and another part of me wasn't ready to confront the possibility that everything I knew could fall apart. So I did what I always did. I pretended everything was fine, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something was wrong, and it wasn't going away. That evening, Mom came home. Her usual smile faded the second she walked in. I didn't understand why at first. She was always so welcoming, so warm. But this time she seemed distant. She didn't greet me with her usual energy, didn't ask how my day had been. There was a coldness to her that I couldn't place, a heaviness in the air that hadn't been there before. She glanced at Dad, and I saw the shift in her eyes. Something had changed. The atmosphere in the room felt thick, almost suffocating. Dad, of course, tried to act normal. He always did. He smiled awkwardly, a kind of forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. He tried to make a joke to lighten the mood, but it fell flat. Mom didn't even respond. She just took off her coat slowly, staring at the floor, as though she was trying to hold herself together. I felt that strange tension in the room even more now. I wanted to say something, to ask what was going on, but I knew it wasn't my place. It wasn't something I could fix. Mom put her purse down and walked into the kitchen without saying much. Dad followed her, trying to catch her eye, trying to make her laugh, but she didn't respond. She didn't seem angry, but she didn't seem like herself either. It was like she was keeping something locked away, and I had no idea what it was. I stayed where I was, unsure of what to do. I watched them from the doorway of the living room. Dad's movements became more frantic, like he was trying to salvage something, but there was no salvaging this. Mom finally turned to him, her face tight, and asked in a voice that didn't sound like hers, "What is going on, Derek?" The room went still, like the whole house was holding its breath. I stood frozen, unsure if I should leave or stay. I wanted to run, to pretend I didn't hear anything, but I couldn't. I could feel at the moment everything would change. I heard Dad speak, but the words didn't register. I only heard the silence that followed. And then, in a voice I had never heard from my mom, she asked, "You've been seeing her, haven't you?" Her words hit like a punch. It felt like time stopped. Everything that had been simmering beneath the surface suddenly exploded. The air became thick with tension, and for the first time, I saw Dad's facade crack. His face went pale, his eyes wide, as if he had just been caught in something he couldn't hide anymore. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to leave, to go somewhere, anywhere away from this moment. But I was rooted to the spot, unable to move. Mom's voice cracked as she asked again, "Haven't you?" And Dad didn't say anything. He just stood there, silent, and for the first time, I saw him vulnerable in a way I had never known. In that silence, everything became painfully clear. The world as I knew it was shattering around me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The days after everything came out were a blur. Mom cried. Dad barely said a word. And I didn't know what to feel. Part of me wanted to hate Dad, to scream at him for breaking everything. But another part of me was still holding on to the man he used to be, the one who could make everything feel safe again. It was hard to let go of that, to face the reality of the person he had become. Mom tried to hold herself together, but it was clear that something inside her had shattered. She spent her days in a quiet kind of grief, her eyes distant, as if she were somewhere far away, lost in her own thoughts. I tried to reach out, but she just nodded, her responses hollow. It was like she was going through the motions of life, but she wasn't really living it. And Dad? He was quieter than ever. He kept to himself, staring off into space, his eyes empty. It was like he was punishing himself, or maybe he just didn't know what to say anymore. I couldn't tell. I found myself retreating into my room more often, avoiding the heavy silence that hung over the house. It was easier that way, to pretend nothing had changed, to try to keep the world in some semblance of order. But every time I stepped out of my room, I was reminded of the truth that had shattered everything. Dad's betrayal was now the shadow over every corner of our home. The anger I felt toward him was confusing. I couldn't fully express it. I didn't know how to explain the weight of what had happened, how his actions had changed everything I thought I understood about love and loyalty. But at the same time, I still wanted to believe that he was the dad I had known for all these years. I couldn't quite bring myself to let that go, even though I knew, deep down, I had to. How could I trust him again after everything he had done? How could I look at him the same way? Mom never said much after that night. She spent most of her time working, trying to keep the house in order, but it was clear that something inside her had broken. Every so often I would hear her crying softly in her room, but when I went in, she'd wipe her tears away, forcing a smile and pretending everything was fine. But I knew better. Nothing was fine. As I sat in the living room one evening, the TV flickering quietly in the background, I found myself wondering about everything. About Dad, about Mom, about how we would move forward. The truth hung between us like an unspoken question: would things ever be the same again? Could we ever go back to the way things were before? The answer was no. I knew that now. What I didn't know was how to move on, or if we ever would.